Hey everyone, welcome to our tutorial on if and else statements in C Sharp. So as you can see, we're in Visual Studio, and I would like to teach this if else lesson through an example. So I'd like to make an ATM program where a user has an account balance and we display the account balance to the user. So real quick, let's get rid of this hello world right line. And let's create our first user, and we will call this, we'll call him first user, and we'll say that our first user is Pete, right? Similar to our name variable, right? We created a string variable here called Pete. And let's create a double for his balance, because doubles are numbers that have decimal places. So let's call this first balance, and we'll set it equal to $24.80. Cool. So now let's create the output of the program. So we'll do a console.writeLine, which we've seen before. And we'll say, welcome to the ATM. And we'll say console.writeLine. Oops. Please input your username. And now we'll create a variable, again, string, and we'll call this input. And we'll just make it an empty variable for now. We won't assign it to anything. And we'll do a console.readLine, like we did in the previous tutorial on inputs and outputs. And we'll store this console.readLine. So this is going to be the user's input. We'll store it in our input variable. So we'll do our input variable, assignment operator, console.readLine, which we'll put in the user's input. So now let's get to the part on if statements. So an if statement is very straightforward. It starts out with the keyword if, and then you create the two parentheses here. And how this works is you take in an expression here. So we'll just write in expression right now, and so that won't be anything. It'll cause an error. But this is just a placeholder for now. We're going to write a Boolean expression in here. And that Boolean expression will return either a true or false value, like we've talked about before. If it's in between the parentheses here of this if statement, then if it's true, then the if statement will execute code. Now we store that code between these two curly braces. These curly braces create what is called scope. And we'll talk about scope later, but all you need to know now is if this expression evaluates to true, then the code will run what's in between these two curly braces. If this expression evaluates to false, then it won't run this. So for our expression, we're going to be using our equivalence operator, right? So the equivalence operator returns true if the left-hand value, so what's on the left of the equivalence operator, if that equals what's on the right of the equivalence operator. So on the left, we're going to put our input, right? And remember, that's going to be our user input from the console read line. And on the right, we're going to put our first user variable, right? So what we're doing here is we're comparing what the user enters to our first username. And if that's true, then let's do a console.writeLine, and let's write out our user's balance. So let's call this the first balance. So let's print out the first balance. So we have our username and we have our balance. If the user inputs the correct username, it'll print out our balance. Cool, so let's try to run this here. Let's see what we get. Okay, we have please input your username. So for the first example, let's just put in Pete so we know that it matches. And we hit enter, and we see our balance of $24.80. Now, let's try the other possible occurrence, which is the user puts in the wrong name. Let's run it again. Welcome to the ATM. Please input your username. We'll call this one Dave. Let's run it. And nothing happens, right? So Normally when you use an if statement, and I'm going to close the console here, normally when you use an if statement like this, the if statement only works for like one use case, right? And that's for when our input matches our username. For every other instance or every other occurrence, it's not going to work. So for all of those other occurrences, we can do an else block. And so what this else does is this else keyword, it can only come after the if block, right? It can only come after the if. And what the else does is it handles every other case besides this if statement, right? It handles every other case. So in every other situation, when it's not Pete's account, and Pete's our only user here, when it's not his account, we'll say, we don't manage that account. Cool. So now let's run our program again. Please enter your username. Let's enter Dave again. Remember last time when I hit enter, nothing happened. But now we have our else block. So it'll catch every expression that doesn't match our username equaling Pete. And we don't manage that account. So you can see how this works, right? We have our initial if condition. And if it's true, then we'll put in our first balance. If it's not true, we're going to write out we don't manage that account. Now let's do another use case where this can be a little tricky. So let's enter Pete again. So you can see I've entered in Pete, but notice that the P is lowercase. Now the P over here is uppercase. So let's hit enter and see what happens. Now it says we don't manage that account, right? And that's because these two strings don't match, not perfectly, and they have to match 100%. So because this is a capital P and this is a lowercase p, this if statement fails. Now what we can do to correct that is we can put that to lower. And when we do this, it converts all of the user's input to a lowercase. And we can also put dot to lower on our first user username. This will make it so that the capitalization does not matter. It'll convert everything to lowercase. And this is a good idea to do when you're comparing strings. So now let's try it again. I'm going to close this window. Let's run it again. And let's put in Pete again, lowercase this time. And now we see our user's balance. Cool. So the to lower worked here, right? Because it's comparing our lowercase Pete to Pete, but this Pete variable is now being put into all lowercase letters. I'm going to close that. And there's one last piece that I would like to talk to about if-else statements. And that is the situation for else if. So we'll do an else if here. So in situations where we have multiple conditions we want to check for, that's a good situation to use our else if. So let's say we actually added Dave as a user to our bank. So I'll create the Dave variable now, and we'll give Dave a balance of, we'll call this second balance. We'll say this is equal to $49.12. So now we have two users, first user and second user. We have first balance and second balance. So let's scroll down, and we can see down here that we have our input is being checked against our first user. So if it doesn't match the first user, we used to go right into this else block and say we don't manage that account. But now, after we go through this first if, let's go down to this second else if and see if we can check for our second user. So we'll switch this to lower. Say if this equals our second user dot to lower. Cool. So now we have our first check and our second check. So in the else if block for our second user, let's print out our second user's, our second user's balance. Second balance. Nice. Okay. So let's try this again. We'll run this program. And we're going to enter our username. Let's enter Dave's username again. We can say Dave. Before, it said we don't manage this account. Now let's see what it says. Now it prints out Dave's balance, right? Cool. So you can see how these if, else, else's are very powerful because you can only put in one if and you can only put in one else, but you can put in as many else ifs as you want. So if we created a third user and we called him or her, we'll say third user, and we'll call them Simone. And we'll say that Simone has a third balance of $400.45. So we'll go if the input dot toLower is equal to third user dot toLower. Then we're going to we're going to write out the third balance. So now we have 3 users for our bank, and we have 3 of these checks here. We have the initial if check, and then we have 2 else ifs, followed by an else. So let's go, I'll close this terminal window, and I'll run this program. And we have input your username, we'll say Simone. We have $400.45. Now, let's close this terminal window, run it one last time, and we'll put in Gary, right? So this username doesn't match anybody. And we see we don't manage that account. So you can see how these are very powerful. We have our one if, right? We can only have one if. We can only have one else statement, but we can have as many else ifs as we want. And each else if checks another expression for it to be true. And if none of the else ifs are true, and none of the ifs and the if isn't true, then this else block will take over. Cool. So that is our quick tutorial on if, else if, and else statements in C#. Thanks.